In the summer of 46 BC, a man who once commanded 80,000 warriors stands in a stone pit beneath the streets of Rome. The ceiling above him has a single opening, a round hole barely wide enough for a human body to pass through. The walls are wet. The air tastes of mineral water and mildew and something older, something iron and organic that has seeped into the rock over centuries of use. His name is Vercingetorix. 6 years ago, he was a king. He had united the fractious tribes of Gaul into a single fighting force, burned his own cities to deny Rome their grain, and held Julius Caesar himself pinned outside the walls of Gergovia in one of the most humiliating setbacks of Caesar's career. Now his muscles have wasted. His hair is matted against his skull. His skin has not seen direct sunlight since the siege of Alesia. And today, the guards are coming to take him upstairs, into the light for the last time. What Rome is about to force him to do is not punishment. It is theater. And the ritual they have designed for his final hours is so precisely engineered, so meticulously staged, that most history books still decline to describe it in full. He is not the first king to stand in this pit. He will not be the last. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, the kind that goes deeper than the version you were taught, subscribe to Unnuanced and turn on notifications. We are just getting started. To understand what is about to happen to Vercingetorix and to the dozens of captured kings, queens, and warlords who shared his fate across 7 centuries of Roman expansion, you have to understand something fundamental about how Rome thought about victory. For the Romans, winning a war was not enough. A general who defeated an enemy army and returned home had accomplished something useful, certainly, but useful was not sacred. To transform a military victory into something that mattered, something that elevated a mortal man above the ordinary ranks of Roman citizens and placed him for a single day in the company of the gods, you needed something else entirely. You needed the triumph. The Roman triumph was among the most elaborate public rituals the ancient world ever produced. It was a religious ceremony, a propaganda spectacle, a political weapon, and a form of mass entertainment, all compressed into a single procession that wound through the streets of Rome from the Campus Martius to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, a distance of roughly 4 kilometers that could take an entire day to traverse. Wagons carried captured gold and silver. Painted placards depicted the conquered lands. Exotic animals from distant provinces were led through the streets. Musicians played, incense burned, soldiers sang. And at the front of it all, in chains, walked the defeated. The captives were the centerpiece, not the treasure. Not the ivory, not the elaborate wooden scaffolding depicting battle scenes. The human being in chains was the thing the crowd had come to see, because the most valuable captive of all was not a soldier, not a general, not even a noble. It was a king, a man who had once been obeyed, worshipped, feared, now walking barefoot through streets slick with flower petals and animal waste, wearing the chains Rome had selected for him, performing his own destruction for an audience of 1 million. And the first king Rome fed into this machine was an African monarch so clever, so dangerous, and so contemptuous of Roman corruption, that he looked at the most powerful city on earth and saw nothing but a price tag. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, understood Rome better than most Romans did. He had served alongside Roman legions in Spain as a young cavalry commander during the siege of Numantia in 134 BC, fighting under Scipio Aemilianus, who treated him as a friend and a protege. He had watched how Roman officers conducted business after the battles were over. When Rome finally summoned Jugurtha to the capital to testify about his crimes, he arrived under a guarantee of safe conduct, bribed 2 tribunes to block the proceedings entirely, and then arranged the assassination of a rival claimant to his throne while still on Roman soil. According to Sallust, who wrote the definitive history of the war that followed, Jugurtha looked at the city as he was finally expelled from it and delivered a verdict that would echo across 21 centuries. A city for sale, he said, and doomed to quick destruction if it should find a buyer. Rome found the remark less amusing than Jugurtha intended. The Jugurthine War ground on for nearly a decade, from 112 to 105 BC, as Roman commanders struggled to pin down a guerrilla fighter who knew the North African terrain intimately and who understood that Roman generals could be purchased almost as easily as Roman politicians. It took a new kind of Roman commander to end it, a man named Gaius Marius, who could not be bribed and who sent his quaestor Sulla to negotiate directly with Jugurtha's own father-in-law, Bacchus, king of neighboring Mauritania. The deal was transactional, cold, and final. Bacchus would hand over Jugurtha in exchange for the western portion of Numidia. One king sold another for a strip of map. Rome found the remark less amusing than Jugurtha intended. The Jugurthean War ground on for nearly a decade, from 112 to 105 BC, as Roman commanders struggled to pin down a guerrilla fighter who knew the North African terrain intimately and who understood that Roman generals could be purchased almost as easily as Roman politicians. Jugurtha was brought to Rome in chains. During Marius's triumph in 104 BC, the former king of Numidia walked at the front of the procession as the crowd's central attraction. Plutarch tells us what happened during that walk. Soldiers stripped Jugurtha of his royal robes as the procession moved through the streets. Then they reached for his gold earrings, the heavy ornaments that marked Numidian royal status, and they did not bother with the clasps. They ripped the metal from his flesh. Jugurtha lost part of both earlobes. The jewelry came away wet with blood, and the crowd that watched this did not flinch, because this was not cruelty. This was the show. After the procession, Jugurtha was lowered through the opening in the ceiling of the Tullianum, the stone chamber beneath the Roman Forum that served as Rome's execution cell for enemies of the state. The rhetorician Calpurnius Flaccus described this place in terms that still feel suffocating across 2,000 years, a prison of huge stone blocks receiving through narrow chinks just a faint semblance of light, where culprits watched others being punished and learned from the sight what their own end would look like. Plutarch records what happened to Jugurtha inside that chamber. He was not executed immediately. He was left there. According to Plutarch, for 6 days, the man who had controlled an entire desert kingdom and outwitted Rome's finest generals clung to life in darkness, without food, without water, without anyone who would speak to him. Other sources suggest he may have been strangled, as was more customary for captives of this rank. Either way, he died underground, alone, in the same city he had once called a marketplace, and the marketplace had finally set his price at exactly nothing. But Jugurtha's ordeal, as terrible as it was, lasted weeks from capture to death. The next man Rome would lower into that same pit would wait there for 6 years, and his name, Vercingetorix, was one that Julius Caesar himself could not speak without acknowledging what it meant: supreme king of warriors. Vercingetorix did not come to the rebellion as an outsider. By some historical reconstructions, he had spent time inside Caesar's inner circle during the early campaigns in Gaul, possibly serving as a cavalry auxiliary, certainly observing Roman military methods at close range. He had watched how the legions moved, how they fortified, how they supplied themselves across hostile terrain. He understood the machine. And in 52 BC, when he returned to his people and began organizing the most dangerous revolt Caesar would ever face, he used what he had learned to devastating effect. He burned his own cities. He torched granaries, destroyed bridges, poisoned wells. He denied Caesar's legions the one thing they could not function without: food, and he forced the Roman campaign to stall in territory that had been deliberately transformed into a wasteland. At Gergovia, the fortified hilltop capital of the Arverni, Vercingetorix handed Caesar something the Roman general had almost never experienced: a defeat. Caesar's assault on the walls failed. His legions withdrew with heavy casualties. For a brief, extraordinary window, it appeared that Gaul might actually break free. Then came Alesia. Vercingetorix pulled his army of roughly 80,000 warriors into the hilltop fortress and waited for a relief force to arrive from the surrounding tribes. Caesar responded with one of the most audacious engineering projects in military history. He built a ring of fortifications 10 miles in circumference around the entire town, a barrier of trenches, sharpened stakes, watchtowers, and infantry positions designed to seal Vercingetorix inside. Then he built a second ring facing outward to defend against the Gallic relief army he knew was coming. When that army arrived, perhaps 250,000 strong, Caesar fought on 2 fronts simultaneously: Vercingetorix attacking from within, the relief force attacking from without, and he held both lines. The relief army broke and scattered. Alesia was doomed. According to Cassius Dio, Vercingetorix made his decision the following morning. He put on his finest armor. He mounted his best horse. He rode out through the gates and circled Caesar's seated position in a slow, deliberate loop, a final display of the sovereignty he was about to surrender. Then he dismounted. He stripped off his war gear piece by piece: the mail shirt, the sword, the shield, and laid them at Caesar's feet. He sat down on the ground. in silence. Dio suggests he may have hoped for clemency. He and Caesar had been close once. If that was his calculation, he misjudged the man. Caesar had him placed in chains immediately. What followed was roughly 6 years of near-total silence. Roman historians, who wrote volumes about Caesar's campaigns, about his political maneuvering, about his love affairs, and his dinner parties and his grammatical opinions, recorded almost nothing about the man sitting in the cell beneath the Forum. We know Vercingetorix was held in the Tullianum, the same stone pit where Jugurtha had died. We know the cell was roughly 7 meters across, carved from tufa rock, with a natural spring that seeped through the floor and kept the stone permanently damp. We know from Calpurnius Flaccus that the darkness was nearly total, the air foul, and that prisoners could hear the creak of the iron door above them and the sounds of others being executed in the same chamber. We do not know what Vercingetorix thought during those years. We do not know if he spoke to anyone. We do not know if he was told what was happening in the world above him, that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, that civil war had consumed the Republic, that the man who put him in this pit was remaking Rome in his own image. All we know is that in 46 BC, when Caesar finally returned to the capital to celebrate 4 triumphs in rapid succession, one for each of his major campaigns, soldiers descended into the Tullianum and hauled Vercingetorix back into the light. The man who emerged bore no resemblance to the warrior who had ridden out at Alesia. He was gaunt. He was broken. The supreme king of warriors was paraded through the streets of Rome as proof that Gaul had been tamed, and the crowd that lined the route looked at what 6 years in the dark had done to a human body, and they cheered. Most scholars believe Vercingetorix was strangled in the Tullianum shortly after the procession ended, though some ancient sources suggest beheading, and the exact method remains debated. His body was likely disposed of through the drain in the floor of the cell, a channel that connected to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer. The supreme king of warriors left Rome the same way the sewage did. 2 years later, Caesar himself was dead, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate by men he had trusted and pardoned. No Roman historian recorded the parallel. A man who destroyed a king in a stone chamber, destroyed by his own allies in a marble one. But Rome's triumph machine did not die with Caesar. It was inherited by the emperors who came after him, and one of them would refine the ritual to its most precise and disturbing form. An execution so exactly timed that the priests at Jupiter's temple could not begin the sacred sacrifice until a runner arrived from the Forum to confirm that the captive had stopped breathing. If you have made it this far, you are not here for the simplified version of history. You are here because the full version matters to you. Consider subscribing to Unnuanced so you do not miss what comes next, because what comes next is the machine itself, and understanding how it worked changes how you see everything Rome ever built. The triumph was not improvised. It was engineered. Every element of the procession, from the order of march to the color of the general's robes, followed a logic that had been refined across centuries of repetition. The route itself was fixed. The procession assembled before dawn on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, an open expanse outside the city's sacred boundary, where the general still held his military command. From there it entered Rome through a gate used for no other purpose, the Porta Triumphalis, and crossed the boundary line called the Pomerium, at which point the general formally surrendered his command to the Senate. The procession then wound south past the Circus Flaminius, skirted the base of the Capitoline Hill, passed through the Velabrum, and entered the Circus Maximus, where 150,000 spectators could watch from tiered seating as the wagons rolled past. It continued along the Via Sacra into the Forum, then climbed the Capitoline Hill to the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, where the general would offer sacrifice. The total distance was roughly 4 kilometers, at walking pace, with planned stops, and the sheer mass of people, treasure, animals, and military units involved. The procession could take an entire day. This is the distance Jugurtha walked barefoot, bleeding from both ears. The general stood at the center of this spectacle, dressed in a costume that deliberately blurred the line between mortal and divine. He wore the toga picta, an all-purple robe embroidered with gold thread, over a tunica palmata decorated with palm leaf designs. On his head sat a crown of laurel. In one hand he carried an ivory scepter topped with an eagle, in the other a laurel branch. In some accounts his face was painted red, perhaps in imitation of the terracotta statue of Jupiter that stood inside the temple on the Capitoline, though scholars remain divided on whether this was standard practice or occasional display. He rode standing in a 4-horse chariot pulled by white horses, and behind him, according to tradition, a slave held a golden crown above his head while whispering a single phrase into his ear. Remember, you are mortal. Whether this detail is historical fact or later embellishment, its presence in the tradition reveals something important about how Rome understood the triumph. The ritual was so powerful, so intoxicating, that even the Romans themselves recognized it needed a counterweight. The general was, for that single day, as close to a god as any living Roman could be. The whisper was the thread connecting him to the earth. But if the general ascended, the captive descended, and the staging of captured enemies was as carefully calibrated as every other element of the procession. Rome did not treat all prisoners the same way. Some captives were dressed in the full regalia of their former kingdoms, their crowns and robes and ceremonial weapons displayed not as marks of authority but as trophies, proof that Rome had conquered something worth conquering. Others were stripped nearly bare, their degradation itself the message. The choice depended on the political narrative the triumphing general wanted to construct. A powerful enemy, in royal clothing, magnified the scale of Rome's achievement. A contemptible enemy, in rags, magnified Rome's superiority. Both served the same function. Both reduced a sovereign to a prop, and the crowd understood both registers. Suetonius records that during Caesar's triumph in 46 BC, soldiers marching behind the chariot sang obscene songs about their own commander, mocking his alleged affairs in terms that would make a modern audience blush. The crowd laughed. Even the general's dignity was subject to the ritual's appetite. No one in the procession was fully exempt from being consumed by it. According to the historian Orosius, roughly 320 triumphs were celebrated in Rome before the 1st century AD. Not all featured captive royals, but enough did that the sight of a defeated king in chains became one of the defining images of Roman civilization, reproduced on coins, carved into marble arches, woven so deeply into Roman identity that it shaped how Romans understood their place in the world. They were the people who made kings walk. Every element of this machine, the route, the costume, the treasure, the crowd, the songs, the whispered reminder of mortality, was designed to elevate one man toward the divine. But the ritual contained one final act that most modern accounts mention only in passing, if they mention it at all. At a certain point along the route, as the procession turned from the Forum toward the ascending slope of the Capitoline, the most prominent captive was separated from the parade. The general's chariot continued upward, toward the temple, toward Jupiter, toward the sacrifice that would seal the triumph as sacred. The captive was led in the opposite direction, downward, underground, into the same pit where Jugurtha had starved and Vercingetorix had spent 6 years waiting for the light. The general rose toward the gods. The king sank into the earth. And in one particular triumph, what happened in that pit was timed to the second, because the priests standing at the altar on the Capitoline could not begin the sacred sacrifice until a messenger arrived from the Forum carrying a single piece of information: the captive is dead. In the summer of 71 AD, Rome staged a spectacle that would not be equaled for scale or precision in the remaining 4 centuries of the empire. The triumph of Vespasian and Titus, celebrating victory over the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem, drew a crowd that Josephus, who witnessed it firsthand, estimated at over 300,000. This was not a routine celebration. The Flavian dynasty was new, fragile, desperately in need of legitimacy. Vespasian had seized power during the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, and the Jewish triumph was his proof to the Roman people that the gods had chosen correctly. Every detail was engineered to overwhelm. 700 captives had been selected from the survivors of the siege, chosen specifically for their height and physical appearance, because the Romans understood that the visual impact of prisoners mattered as much as their number. Multi-story wooden scaffolding rolled through the streets, each platform displaying elaborately staged scenes from the campaign, tapestries and golden frames and ivory carvings, representations of burning cities and fleeing armies so vivid that Josephus wrote they made spectators feel as though they were watching the war itself. And at the center of the spoils, carried on the shoulders of Roman soldiers, came the sacred objects from the Temple of Jerusalem: the golden menorah, the table of showbread, the Torah scrolls, items that had stood in the inner sanctum of one of the most important religious buildings in the ancient world, now carried as the property of a new god to a new temple on a different hill. Walking among the 700, dressed in rags as a deliberate mockery of the authority he had once claimed, was Simon bar Giora. He had been the most feared of the Jewish revolutionary leaders, a man who had rallied slaves and the dispossessed with promises of liberation, who had seized control of Jerusalem in the final months before the siege. When the city fell in the summer of 70 AD, Simon disappeared into the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount with a small group of followers and a team of stonecutters attempting to dig his way to freedom. When the food ran out before the tunnel was finished, he made one last theatrical gesture. He dressed himself in white robes over his military garments and climbed to the surface at the exact spot where the temple had stood, rising from the earth like an apparition. The Roman sentries froze. Then they seized him. He was sent to Rome to wait for the triumph. Josephus tells us what happened next with the precision of a man recording a legal proceeding. When the procession reached the Forum, Simon was separated from the other captives. A rope was placed around his neck. He was dragged to the traditional execution spot near the Tullianum. The soldiers escorting him struck him as he was pulled along, and at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, the procession stopped. Vespasian and Titus stood at the altar. The white oxen were ready. The priests waited. Nobody moved. The ancient custom required the generals to hold their position until a messenger arrived from the Forum with a single confirmation. The enemy leader is dead. The silence held. Then the runner came. Simon bar Giora was gone. The crowd erupted. The oxen were slaughtered. The sacrifices began. The triumph was complete. The killing and the prayer were the same act. One could not exist without the other. The captive's death was not an epilogue to the spectacle. It was the offering that made the spectacle sacred. The Arch of Titus still stands at the eastern end of the Roman Forum. Its relief carvings show the menorah and the sacred table being carried in procession, Roman soldiers crowned with laurel, the spoils of Jerusalem on permanent display in stone. Millions of tourists photograph it every year. Almost none of them know that the procession this arch commemorates could not be completed until a man was killed a few hundred meters from where they are standing. If that detail changed something in how you see Rome, share this video with one person who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, subscribe to Unnuanced. We do not simplify history, we complete it. But the Tullianum did not swallow every captive who entered it. Not every monarch who walked in a Roman triumph died at the end of the route. One queen, the most powerful woman in the Eastern Mediterranean, may have walked out of her chains entirely. And her story is stranger than any execution, because what Rome did to Zenobia of Palmyra remains, after 17 centuries, genuinely unknown. Zenobia had built an empire. While Rome convulsed through the crisis of the 3rd century, lurching from one short-lived emperor to the next, she seized the vacuum and filled it. From her capital at Palmyra, an oasis city where the caravan routes of the Syrian desert converged, she extended her control over Egypt, most of Syria, and large portions of Anatolia. She commanded armies. She rode with her cavalry on campaign. She marched on foot alongside her infantry. Ancient sources describe her as physically striking, with dark skin, dark eyes, and teeth so white that some believed she wore pearls in her mouth. She spoke Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian, and she claimed descent from Cleopatra, a lineage almost certainly constructed for political purposes, but one that reveals how she wanted the world to understand her. She was not merely a regional power. She was a queen in the tradition of queens who had defied Rome and nearly won. In 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian marched east to end it. He shattered Zenobia's forces at Imae and again at Emesa, then besieged Palmyra itself. When the city's food ran out and her hoped-for Persian reinforcements failed to arrive, Zenobia fled on camelback toward the Euphrates, attempting to cross into Sassanid territory. Aurelian's cavalry intercepted her at the riverbank. The warrior queen of Palmyra was brought back in chains, and the chains Aurelian selected for her were not iron, they were gold. According to the Historia Augusta, a source historians treat with caution, but which preserves details found nowhere else, Zenobia was paraded through Rome during Aurelian's triumph in 274 AD wearing golden shackles and laden with jewels so heavy she could barely walk. A slave walked beside her to help bear the weight. The gold and gemstones that had once adorned her as symbols of sovereignty had been refashioned into instruments of subjugation. She was being crushed by the physical mass of her own former wealth. Gold is denser than iron. This was not mercy, it was a refinement, an innovation in the machinery of humiliation. and then Zenobia disappears. The ancient sources fracture into contradictions that have never been resolved. Zosimus writes that she died before reaching Rome, possibly from illness, possibly by refusing to eat, an echo of Cleopatra choosing death over display. But Zosimus also offers a contradictory version in which she arrived in Rome, stood trial, and was acquitted. The Historia Augusta claims Aurelian gave her a villa at Tibur, modern Tivoli, where she lived out her years as a Roman matron, married a senator, raised daughters who married into the nobility, and became known for her lavish dinner parties and her outlandish Latin accent. The chronicler Malalas, writing centuries later, says she was beheaded. 3 endings, 3 entirely different fates. The full spectrum from annihilation to absorption. Most modern scholars lean toward the villa, reasoning that Aurelian would have wanted a living, domesticated Zenobia to serve his political narrative better than a dead one. But certainty does not exist. The woman who built an empire from the Syrian desert either died in chains or died in a garden, and 17 centuries of scholarship have not determined which. What we do know is what her uncertain fate reveals about the system itself. Rome's treatment of captive royals was not governed by a single rule. It was governed by calculation. Some captives were more useful dead, some were more useful alive. The triumph could accommodate both outcomes, because its true purpose was never simply the captive's death. Its purpose was the captive's transformation from sovereign to spectacle, from ruler to raw material in someone else's story. Whether that material was discarded afterward or repurposed was a question of utility, not principle. And Zenobia's uncertain ending raises a question that reaches beneath any single biography. Did Rome's system contain room for mercy, or was survival simply another form of conquest? A queen domesticated, her bloodline folded into Roman nobility until the rebellion was bred out of her descendants within a generation. The answer may be visible in the most devastating case the triumph ever produced, a case where the crowd itself faltered, where even Rome's appetite for spectacle met something it could not entirely swallow, a king whose small children were forced to walk in chains beside him. And that king's response when offered a way out reveals something about the triumph that no amount of gold or ritual engineering can explain. Perseus of Macedon was, in a sense that no other captive in this story could claim, the end of an era measured in centuries. He was the last king of the Antigonid dynasty, the royal house that had inherited the eastern portion of Alexander the Great's fractured empire. He was not Alexander's blood descendant, but he was the final occupant of the throne that Alexander's generals had fought and killed to establish. When Perseus fell, the dynasty fell with him. Macedon, the kingdom that had once commanded armies from the Adriatic to the borders of India, ceased to exist as an independent state. It was dissolved, carved into 4 Roman client republics, and eventually absorbed as a province. The triumph that celebrated this extinction lasted 3 days. Aemilius Paulus, the Roman consul who defeated Perseus at the Battle of Pydna on June 22, 168 BC, received permission from the Senate to hold one of the most elaborate triumphs in Republican history. He staged it in September of 167 BC, and the ancient sources describe it with a level of detail that suggests even the Romans understood they were witnessing something exceptional. The first day was dedicated to captured art. 250 wagons rolled through the streets, carrying statues, paintings, and works of craftsmanship seized from Macedonian palaces and temples, the accumulated aesthetic wealth of a dynasty that had patronized Greek culture for generations. The second day belonged to the weapons. Macedonian arms and armor were loaded onto wagons and arranged so that the pieces shifted and crashed against each other as the wagons moved, filling the streets of Rome with the metallic percussion of a battle that existed only as an echo. The ghost of Macedonian military power rattling through the capital of the empire that had destroyed it. The third day was for the people. First came the coined silver and gold, carried in 77 vessels. Then came Perseus's children, 2 young boys and a small girl, accompanied by their weeping attendants and tutors, all walking under visible Roman guard. Plutarch tells us what happened next, and even across 2,000 years, the passage carries a weight that the historian himself seems to have felt. The children were so small and so bewildered by what was happening to them that the crowd along the route began to weep. Roman spectators, the same people who had cheered the stripping of Jugurtha and would one day cheer the dragging of Simon Bar Giora, looked at these children and could not hold their composure. Many reached out their hands toward the small figures. Some wept openly. The children's suffering was so visible, so immediate, that according to Plutarch, few spectators even noticed Perseus walking behind them. The father's humiliation was completed not by his chains, but by his irrelevance. The crowd pitied his children and forgot to look at him. Before the triumph, Perseus had begged Aemilius Paulus not to include the children in the procession. Plutarch records the general's response with the flat precision of a man delivering a verdict. If Perseus wished to avoid this humiliation, Paulus suggested, he was free to take his own life. It was a Roman answer to a Greek plea, and it contained a contempt so refined it barely registered as cruelty. It registered as advice. Perseus did not take it. He walked behind his children through the streets of Rome, watching their tears from a distance he could not close, and he lived. He was imprisoned at Alba Fucens, a town in the mountains east of Rome, where the ancient sources diverge on his fate. Plutarch claims the Romans killed him by keeping him from sleeping, a slow destruction that lasted perhaps 2 years. Livy offers a gentler version, claiming Perseus was kept in reasonable conditions for the rest of his life. The gap between these two accounts may itself reveal something about how Rome preferred its treatment of captive kings to be remembered, harsh enough to serve as warning, gentle enough to avoid the appearance of barbarism. But the detail that contains the full weight of what the triumph accomplished is not the death of the king. It is the life of his son. Alexander, the boy who walked through Rome at the age of 5 or 6, survived. He was kept in custody at Alba Fucens alongside his father. He grew up in Italy, in the shadow of the empire that had erased his family's kingdom. He learned Latin. He learned a trade. He became a skilled metalworker, a man who shaped material with his hands. And then he became a public notary, a clerk in the administrative apparatus of the Roman state. The last heir of the dynasty that had once commanded the known world spent his adult life filing documents for the bureaucracy of the people who had paraded him in chains as a child. He served the machine that had consumed his bloodline, and he did so, as far as the record tells us, without incident, without rebellion, without any visible trace of the sovereignty that had once been his inheritance. The triumph did not merely kill kings, it unmade them. It turned dynasties into footnotes and heirs into clerks, and it did so with such thoroughness that the system itself became invisible, buried not under centuries of earth, but under the quiet assumption that Rome's perspective was the only one that mattered. The Roman triumph was one of the most meticulously documented rituals in the ancient world. Plutarch described it, Josephus witnessed it, Sallust analyzed it, Livy catalogued it, Cassius Dio debated it. Its imagery was carved into marble arches that still stand in the Roman Forum, minted onto coins that collectors hold in their hands today, referenced in poetry that students still translate in university classrooms. By the 5th century, the historian Orosius estimated that roughly 320 triumphs had been celebrated. The Fasti Triumphales, a fragmentary list probably first displayed on the Arch of Augustus, attempted to record them all. No ritual in the ancient Mediterranean was more thoroughly observed, more carefully preserved, or more proudly remembered. And it is, simultaneously, one of the most incomplete records of human experience ever created, because it was written entirely from the perspective of the people holding the chains, never from the people wearing them. We know what Rome saw when it looked at Vercingetorix standing in the procession. We have no idea what Vercingetorix saw when he looked back, at the million faces watching him, at the sky he had not seen in 6 years. We know the crowd cheered when Simon bar Giora was dragged to the forum with a rope around his neck. We do not know what Simon was thinking as the noose tightened, whether he was remembering the tunnels beneath the temple or the white robes he chose for his last emergence into the light. We know that Perseus's children wept and that the crowd wept with them. We do not know what those children dreamed about in the years that followed, growing up in a foreign country, speaking a foreign language, serving the state that had marched them barefoot through its capital at an age when they could not possibly have understood why. The triumph told the same story for 7 centuries. The general ascends, the king descends, Jupiter receives his offering, the world is ordered. The borders are secure. Go home. Sleep soundly. Your generals have fed the gods with the sovereignty of kings, and the gods are satisfied. But ordering the world required a sacrifice, and the sacrifice was always a specific person who had once been worshipped by a specific people in a specific place that Rome had decided to absorb. Jugurtha, who called Rome a marketplace and died proving it. Vercingetorix, who learned Roman warfare from the inside and was consumed by the machine he understood. Simon, whose death unlocked a prayer. Zenobia, who may have survived the chains only to be absorbed into the empire that forged them. Perseus, whose children wept and whose grandson filed documents. The Tullianum still exists. It sits beneath the church of San Giuseppe dei Falegnami in the Roman Forum, and tourists can descend a narrow modern staircase into the same stone chamber where Jugurtha died and Vercingetorix spent 6 years in the dark. The spring still seeps from the floor. The walls are still damp. The space is still roughly 7 meters across, still carved from the same tufa rock, still carrying the faint mineral smell that has not changed in 2 millennia. Visitors take photographs with their phones. They stand in the same space where kings were lowered through a hole in the ceiling, and they read the informational plaques, and they move on to the next stop on the walking tour. The chamber that consumed sovereigns is now a 15-minute detour between the Colosseum and lunch. And perhaps that transformation, from execution site to tourist attraction, is the final triumph of the system Rome built. The violence was so thoroughly absorbed into the foundations of civilization that we now visit it for recreation, moved by the same impulse that filled those streets 2,000 years ago, the desire to stand where power was made visible and where the defeated were put on display. Every civilization that builds a spectacle of power also builds a silence around the people that spectacle consumes. Rome's silence lasted 2,000 years. Listening to it even now, even imperfectly, even through the distortion of sources written by the victors, is the least we owe the men and women who were inside the chains. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it changed how you see Rome, or how you think about the distance between a spectacle and the people trapped inside it, I would be grateful if you subscribed to Unnuanced. Every subscriber helps us keep telling the version of history that includes everyone who was in the room, not only the ones who built it. I will see you in the next one.